All right, well, thanks for everyone for coming out tonight. I'm Blake Wintry. I'm the Director of Education and Preservation at the Heritage Foundation. I know it's hard to tell it, but this is a full house, so we thank you for practicing social distancing and working with us. It's new to the theater staff, and it's new to me too. But a little bit of housekeeping. I want to thank our volunteers, Joan, Jill, and Martha, who came out tonight to help y'all get seated and check y'all in. And thank the theater staff for letting us use their venue and signing seats and everything. So Kari, Paul, Meg, Hunter, and Richard. So thank you to them. So we're in the middle of a pandemic, so a little more housekeeping. So when the program's over, we don't want people congregating out in the lobby. Just trying to be nice about it, but just be mindful and follow the rules. We're also filming tonight. And so we will post the video on our website or other platforms in a couple of days. So if you had friends that couldn't make it tonight or couldn't get a ticket, they can watch later. Also, if you brought your cell phone, please mute it or turn it off. And that's what I'm going to do right now. So mine won't ring. And then also, we're going to take questions afterwards. So since we're filming this, y'all aren't mic'd and we're not passing a mic around. So either I will repeat the question or Rick will repeat your question, but we will take questions at the end. This lecture series is the Warwick Lecture Series, and it is named for our county historian, Rick Warwick. And this series is something we started earlier this year, and it highlights Middle Tennessee history, architecture, preservation authors. So in February, we learned about a multi-year historic archaeological survey of Tennessee Rosenwald schools from Ben Nance of the Tennessee Division of Archaeology. Did anyone come to that lecture? Melvin, did anyone else? Wait over here. And then in September, we're going to have a presentation from Chris Kinder, who is the Historic Preservation Specialist with the Tennessee Historical Commission. And that's scheduled for September 15th. We'll see how things go with the pandemic. But he's going to be talking on mid-century architecture in Middle Tennessee. And he's going to focus on Williamson County as best he can, talk about why that architecture. A lot of that stuff is becoming historic now, even though a lot of people don't necessarily understand it or appreciate it. But a lot of that stuff is nearing 50 years of age, and he's going to talk about why it's historically significant. So tonight's Warwick lecture is by Rick Warwick. So he's the namesake for the lecture series, and he's going to be talking about the photographs of Lemuel Parker. So many of y'all know Rick. He was appointed the county historian in 2017. He's been volunteering his time with the Heritage Foundation since the early 1990s. He retired in 1992 after 24 years as an educator at Hillsborough School in western Williamson County. He's authored more than 15 books, including a recent one on barns in Williamson County. And he's authored numerous articles in the Williamson County Historical Journal, which he edited from 1989 to 2019. And he's put up countless and written countless historical markers that are throughout the county as he's chronicled the county's history. Rick maintains his office at the Heritage Foundation, the Leahy McGidd Big House for Preservation. And if you can't find him there, you'll probably find him at the county archives, especially in the morning. So please welcome Rick Warwick for tonight's lecture. Yeah, come out. You.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Lem Parker, on this first slide, as I said, was a man of many talents. And in this house, after Dr. Powell bought it, he discovered this box of glass negatives. And they turned out they were about 51 slides. There were a couple of them that were broken, and some of them were damaged with spots. You'll see some of them on this presentation. Today, well, just recently, Gary Fister-John from New York bought this house, and he retired from Random House. He was editor at Random House in New York, and this was kind of his getaway house coming to Williamson County. And he did a real smart thing. He bought it, I think he paid about $300,000 about 10 years ago, and he sold it for $1.5 million back about 3 months ago. So you see this little two-room log house, and then an L in the back. It gives us a good sign of how Williamson County has prospered. But thanks to Lemuel Parker, we have the community of Bingham and Liepers Fork being documented in some great slides. Okay, I made a little map for you in case some of you all may not know where Bingham is, but this is just a Williamson County map, and you can see Bingham. Really, if you go on up to where Carter, we have one photograph that was taken on Old Charlotte Pike that I know of, and then of course Waddell Hollow. There's going to be several families that live there. That was where the Tuckers lived, and the Garretts and the Waddells. And then you're coming down to Bingham, and Bingham is, at the time, there was the Charlie Gray store, which was at the intersection of Boyd Mill Pike, and then there was the short store, which McMillan ran later, was back up the road a little piece towards Waddell Hollow, and then there was a store actually at the intersection of Waddell Hollow, and that's where the post office was originally. And then, of course, you're coming down to Hallguy. Isn't that a lovely name? Or it was the West Harpeth Cumberland Presbyterian Church. It was built like in 1850 something. It broke away from the church at Liepers Fork, which we'll see in a few minutes, and it became instead of a union church, it came down and had its own congregation, and we'll see pictures of it. And then Parker Branch, and I put in red there, that's about where the Parker home is. The next house going back towards Old Hillsborough Road would have been the Meacham place, and you're going to see Margaret and Florence. And then the Pointer place, which is on the corner of Hillsborough Road, and it's still standing. And then, of course, coming down the road, you're going to come into Liepers Fork, and the people out there are kind of schizophrenic in their name because many of the old timers still call it Hillsborough, and the new people like the term Liepers Fork, and both of them are interchangeable because it was Hillsborough first and then became Liepers Fork in 1818. And then, of course, there's two churches there, the Methodist Church and the Church of Christ, and we'll get to see those. And there's so many little blacksmith shops and people involved, the doctors there. I think there's going to be I think there's going to be 4 doctors you're going to see in this presentation. And then the last picture is down on Bailey Road, or one of the last pictures. So, this is an example, I think, of the detail that you can see in his photographs. But this is a picture of him with his 2 sons. Actually, I met Milton about the last year we were at the old school. Milton was living in Florida, and he came to the area to have a reunion, I think, with some of the family, and he came up to Hillsborough because he went to school there. And so I did get to speak with him. And then, of course, the next picture is Milton and Harley and their mother. And Harley, he was kind of the renegade of the family. He was the most spoiled man in the neighborhood. His mother saw no faults in him at all, and he had more motorbike wrecks than is allowed for one human. We think that the earliest photograph in this collection is taken in 1911. In that box of negatives, they're in an envelope, a brown envelope, and he has very carefully identified what you're seeing. Some of them, those envelopes were gone, and so I had to do some research, and there's some of them I haven't been able to identify, but so forth. Isn't this lovely? The smokehouse is still there, the logs, and this, of course, is his family on a burro, and then Harley's on there by himself. A great rural scene. The date is not on the negative, but I've tried to, knowing when Harley was born, figure out about what his age is, so I'm thinking that's about 1918. Here's his mother. She was Amanda Bingham Parker. Her father was in the Civil War, and then she married DeWitt Clinton Parker, and he was in the Civil War and lost a leg. And when they had the sale, after Miss Powell was moving to town, she had a sale, and there was still a lot of things in the house that had belonged to the Parkers, and one of them was a wooden leg that came for sale, and everybody joked about it. But he served in the county as county court clerk for several years. The populace in Franklin and Williamson County were very generous to the old Confederate soldiers, particularly those that were blind or had lost a limb, and they elected them to office to give them a good job. Down at the bottom we have her parents, Betty Forehand McPherson, and then John B. And see, he lost a leg, but he lost a leg in an accident at the sawmill, not in the Civil War. And then, of course, would be his sister-in-laws and wife. Laura is the one sitting with the dog. Isn't this a great scene? This is Fernvale, and if you all haven't been to Fernvale, you need to go. It's if you're at Liepers Fork, take Old 96 through Kingfield and down the hill, and you get into the South Harpeth watershed, and at the Old 96 and Old Harding Road is the community of Fernvale. And you can see here, this is July 4th, 1915, and I have been able to identify his brother John and his wife Sadie are on the left there, and then Green McPherson and his wife, and on over to Harley. Laura is holding Harley, and then their sister-in-laws are in there, and the mother is dressed in black, and the rest of them are unidentified. And then the man standing there is John Henry Givens, and he lived in Fernvale, and that's a good photograph of him. This is Lemuel's first cousin was Robert Pointer, and his father was Dr. A.B. Pointer. And if you know me, I've been working with the Pointer family because of Dick Pointer. And Dick Pointer would have probably stayed in that house for a while, because after his father died, or owner died, Dr. Pointer was the one assigned to own Dick Pointer. And you can see his family there. There's a niece in there, Bernice Cato, and then his aunt, who is Millie Bingham Pointer, and she's a sister to Amanda. This house is still standing. It's on Old Hillsborough Road, right before you get to Parker Branch Road, if you're going towards Liepers Fork. You know, horse and buggies were very popular, particularly with young boys and young men, like automobiles are today. But this is Church Uten. I didn't know him, but I knew his two daughters, May and Elizabeth. Elizabeth lived out on Carter's Creek Pike. May lived up on Claiborne Street. And then Walter Tucker and the Ray girls. Now he doesn't, I just found this out today. I was going through those envelopes, and very faintly I could read that Walter Tucker was with the Ray girls. So I'm going to have to go figure out who they were. Isn't this lovely? I don't know who the couple there is on the left, but his brother-in-laws are Robert and Green McPherson, and Millard, of course, and his wife are in the automobile. Then this is another automobile. It's not the same one, and this is Dr. Harley, and that's where Harley got his name, was through Dr. Edelman, and he lived right in Liepers Fork, where, if any of y'all remember where Rooster Mealer lived, that was Dr. Edelman's lived there around 1916. And you can see the license plate on there is a 1916 license plate. This is Hogeye. Supposedly all the old timers told me, Miss Nan was the best authority on it, she said one night they were having a service and the floors apparently were old and a knot had fallen out, and you can see it's up off the ground, and apparently hogs were up under the floor, and some person looked down in the knot hole and there was a hog looking up at him, so it became Hogeye. It was there in 1971, and I'll never forget coming back from school one afternoon on Old Hillsborough Road and seeing the ashes. It had been rented, a family was living there, and I think they set it on fire to get a little charity because they moved to Fairview and they were crying that, they'd lost everything. Well, it's funny, but there wasn't a refrigerator or a stove in the ashes. So I suspect they moved the refrigerator and the stove and then set the place on fire. But isn't that a lovely panorama? This is a picnic, and that's what he's got on there, picnic, Hogeye. That's on there, and that's a nice panoramic scene. And then, of course, interestingly, this singing school is taken inside. If you know anything about photography, it was difficult to take an inside photograph, and that seems to be a pretty sharp photograph. The man in the back with the bonnet on is Henry Mack Cotton. And of course, he had the funeral home here in Franklin. And his family, I see some of his sisters in there, Miss Uten, and one of the Blankenship boys is standing there at the front. But that's a very sharp picture, I think, for. This is probably the most timely picture that I have. And when I first got it, I looked and I said, VW. Volkswagen wasn't invented then. And I know exactly where this is at his sawmill, which is on up the road past his house on the other side of the road, right near the creek. And this is, I was reading in 1918, October the 5th, Franklin had a Liberty Bond parade, and the ladies organizing it had invited all the groups and clubs in Williamson County to come and march. And it listed all those organizations that were in there, and one of them was Votes for Women. This is 1918, and of course it's right before World War I has the armistice in November 11th, and then of course 2 years later, Tennessee brings in the Perfect 36, and women get the right to vote, which we're celebrating this year. And this is another iconic photograph. I love it. And you can see his mother and his wife, she looks like she could be expecting, or looks like they're cleaning chitlins. And then John is the man over on the end there. And you notice the man in the back carrying the rifle. That is the William Kirby rifle. And that was Lem Parker's grandfather. And he was also Mr. Harold Meacham's grandfather. And Mr. Harold told me how irritated he was because he read in the newspaper that on Saturday they were going to have a sale at Lem Parker's house, and in there was the rifle. He said, I couldn't sleep that night thinking I was going to finally get my granddaddy's rifle back. He got there Saturday morning, and to his disappointment, Mr. Charlie Hefner had talked Mr. Lem Parker out of it the day before. So it never went through the sale, and Mr. Meacham never got the rifle. Today, however, it is in the county archives. So if you want to go see a local crafted rifle, go to the county archives. And I was asking Mr. Charlie Hafner when I went down to his house to photograph it. It's interesting because the hammer, instead of going this way, goes out from the side. And I said, Mr. Charlie, how common is this? He said, well, if I find another, and that'll make two. He was a witty person. And then, of course, the two twins there, you'll see they've got caps on, one in the back and the bottom. That is Jerry Carroll and Burl Carroll, and they were twins. And then, of course, you see the guy sitting down holding a hog head. That is John Dorton. And John Dorton was kind of taken in by the Parkers, and he lived with them. I noticed in the census he's listed. That's how I identified who he was. But isn't that a mess of hogs? Imagine the sausage and the hams and the tenderloins you get out of that. But isn't that a great picture? This is Bingham School. And I was looking at this yesterday, and I said, you know, I knew 10 people in this photograph. And this was taken in 1911. But some of you all may remember Miss Sue Owen. She taught at Lipscomb Elementary too, and this is her brother Frank, is this boy right there. That's Miss Sue. Miss Ida May's in there, that's another sister. And of course the Vaughn girls, that's Bertha, is up at the top row. No, in the second from the top. And of course then the Meacham girls, which you're going to see later, are two of the finest. That's Marguerite, and that is Florence. Two of the brightest girls. They graduated from BGA when girls could go to BGA, and they were just invaluable to me, knowing the community and Franklin, because they both worked in town. Margaretta worked with the Harpeth Insurance Company, and Florence worked at the ASCS office because they knew everybody's business and they knew all the secrets. I see Hazel Blankenship right there, and that's her brother. She at that time was a Cotton, but she married Church Uten, is the teacher, and that was her first and only year teaching. Back then, teachers were making $30 a month. Her parents were running the poor farm up in Stillhouse Hollow, so she didn't have to pay board. She could live in the community. And I think that's the only, I think she married the next year, married about 1912. This is a classic. When I got this picture from Margaretta and Florence, of course, it was printed out, and it didn't have the photographer's name on it. But then when I got the glass negative, it got me to thinking, oh, some of the pictures I've used in the Liepers Fork book were taken by Lemuel Parker. You can see these girls are barefooted with their little summer dresses on, and their white-faced bull. Boyd's Mill. This was the nerve center of the community. And not only just for Bingham, but for all over. I was reading went back and read the Who's Who books that Miss Jane Owen articles she wrote, and even people living way back up Pinewood Road talked about bringing a turn of corn to Boyd Mill and spending the day while the mill was being, the corn was being ground in the cornmeal. The Boards were famous for their mules, and you're going to see in the next picture, they had several mule barns, and some of them are still standing. Unfortunately, about the time, I think 1918, the mill was gutted of its iron. They were selling it because scrap iron was so valuable. Mr. Charlie Gray bought from the Shorts. And then this was used really as a tobacco barn for curing tobacco. On the side, which was added later by the Shorts, was a storage, it was a warehouse. And Dudley Casey even rented this building to store tobacco in for his warehouse. You'll see it was, the West Harpeth is a mighty river when it rains, but when it doesn't rain, you can jump across it in places. And so there was a dam there that was it was really boards, cedar boards that backed the water up and directed it into a wheel that turned and operated the mill. Now, when the water was low, they had to go to steam. And so you can see the standpipe there for the steam engine, but they also cut, they cut lumber there. It was a sawmill. And of course you see those fine jacks and mules there. Of course, hogs are right there getting their fill of probably the leftovers. And this is a great panoramic view of my neighborhood. You can see Blazer Road right there where in the middle of the picture where the rail fence goes up. But in the background you'll see this was the old Boyd place. Today I see GDIRs here, and they call that home. And then in the center you can see the big two-story building there that is the mill. Right there, you can see the pipe. This is the Miller house. This is where the miller lived and operated the mill. And then these other buildings are mule barns. I don't know if the West Harpeth flooded back then the way it does today, because I told you in 1948 they raised Old Hillsborough Road to allow for those bridges, and that backed the water up. And so in 1948, where there was one of the biggest floods we ever had, got into the Miller house, and that was supposedly the first time until this great flood we had a few years ago. But isn't that a wonderful, this picture was taken from across the road at the old William Boyd place. And it overlooks it. There's a big barn that was there. It's no longer standing, but it really tells you what a fine farm that was. All along the West Harpeth, some of the best farmland in our county is on these streams like the West Harpeth and the Little Harpeth and the Big Harpeth and the West Harpeth and the South Harpeth. But this scene is just beautiful. And of course, the mill, this gives us a back view, and you can see the water is being directed to, and now the rock foundation is still there that was the channel for the water. And you can see what a big operation that was. This was taken near the snow, so that's why there's not a great deal of contrast in the picture. And then, of course, at the same time, he took this picture of the covered bridge. Now, Boyd Mill Pike was really known as the South Harpeth Turnpike. My favorite man in the 19th century in Williamson County was John B. McEwen. He lived over here on Fair Street. And in 1878, he bought Smith Springs at Fernvale, and he named it Fernvale. He built the hotel, and he needed a way to get good travel from Franklin to Fernvale. And so he got all the property owners that owned land along really the western part of the city of Franklin and all the way out to Old Hillsborough Road, and they created what became known as Boyd Mill Pike. W.A. Boyd was the one that built the road, and he also built this bridge in 1878. And the bridge stood until 1929, and they replaced it with an iron bridge, which fell in the early 90s, I guess. The county road people had they shouldn't have been on the bridge, but they were loaded with rock, and they went across the bridge, and a lady who wasn't from around here followed the truck, and they were both on the bridge at the same time, and with that, the bridge just collapsed. I should have put a picture of that in there, even though he didn't do it. But this is a good scene. Yes, I'm okay. Yeah, I'm okay, thank you. All right, now this is up Waddell Hollow, about one of the second half. The Perry place is first, and then the Blankenship place was next. Now, May Blankenship was also a first cousin of Liam Parker, and I'm pretty sure there's no name on this photograph, but I should have asked Hazel when she gave me the picture. Hazel is the little girl. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, well, hold it. I'm sorry, I'm looking, the screen's messing me up. This is the Short farm. I mean, the Charles Boyd place. He was a Civil War soldier. In his house, if you're in Bingham going towards West Haven, this would be the last house, or next to the last house before you get to the property that is now West Haven, which would have been the old Gray place. But this is the family of the Shorts. Serena Brown, I think, was the last maybe to live there before it burned. Now, this is the Blankenship. Excuse me. Joe Blankenship was the town or the village blacksmith, and his blacksmith shop was there next to the Short store. And he operated it until he died, and I'm not sure exactly. It was in the 50s, I'm sure, when he died. But you can see the family. Sadly, that house is gone, but I think the log the log smokehouse is still standing. And this is further up Waddell Hollow, and you'll see there Nellie Waddell Garrett. The Garretts and the Waddells intermarried along with the Tuckers, and they're all in-laws there standing in front of a log house, which stood until it burned sometime in the 20s. Miss Sue Waddell's house. And of course, that's Luther Waddell and Leland. Leland was known as Pumpkin Waddell, and he continued. His father had a sawmill with a steam engine, and the steam engine, I went up there the other day, and the steam engine has been moved, but it's set right beside the road until just a few months ago. But a nice family. I didn't know Leland. He died before I came to the community, but Luther lived in Nashville and worked for the L&N in the yard. Isn't this a great couple, Sophronia and Solomon King? Is that not the longest face you've ever seen? They lived in probably one of the poorest hollers in Williamson County. When you get to Kingsville and go down the hill going towards Fernvale, they lived down there at the head of Basin Springs. And there's nothing down there but rattlesnakes and copperheads, but they raised a family. And John B. McEwen, Horace German tells this story in his articles, The Night Watch, about Saul King brings in a load of hogs, drives some hogs from his farm into town and sells them to Mr. McEwen. Well, Mr. McEwen, there had been a fire down at the railroad station, and the Parham granary burned, and it scorched all the grain. And so Mr. McEwen had a dairy out here on Nashville Pike before you get to Mac Hatcher, and he was taking the old milk and mixing it with the burnt corn, and it fermented. And so all these hogs got to eating that slop, and they got drunk. And when those King Ridgeback hogs got in there with Mr. McEwen's, there was the awfulest hog fights you've ever seen. So you just can't even trust hogs when they get drunk. And of course, this is a picture of the mill hands at Southall Brothers. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to identify them, but I'm pretty sure they're King's, Howes, Inmans, Hargroves, and Furloughs. And all those guys worked at the sawmill, and you're going to see a picture of it in just a minute. But probably, maybe that whole bunch never learned to read and write. They were unschooled, but hard workers. Now, this is one of the best pictures. I'm glad Laverne's here. This is some of her family. As Mr. Carey Reynolds is the heavy-set man down at the bottom. But they had the steam engine that was mobile that went from farm to farm during thrashing season. And you can see the Jim and Reynolds there, trying to, what has happened, they've gone across the bridge there at Miss Nan's house, which you see Miss Nan Chapman there is in the background. Michael, that's one of those L houses you're talking about. It was built in 1903. And what they're doing, they're having to jack it up to get it out of the way. That opening was necessary because at the Charlie Gray place, he had land on both sides of the road, of Old Hillsborough Road, and he needed a way to get his cows down to the next field, and you didn't want to cross the turnpike. And so this allowed the water to go through, and it also allowed the cattle to go from one field to the next. And I think some of those rock walls are still there today. They've just built over them. I'm glad the Liepers are here tonight because this is their house, but at the time, this was the Charlie Gray place. It was placed on the National Register in 1988, and I'm sorry that there's a misfigurement there on one side of it, but this house looked pretty much like that when I came to town. The Rydens did something to it, and then the Liepers have even improved it more. But that was kind of the nice house in the building, in the community. Here's now one of those L houses, Michael. This was where John Parker, Lem's brother, he built a house right at the intersection of Parker Branch Road and Old Hillsborough Road. Later behind it, Calvin Leahy's father had his sawmill there. And this house became Mr. Floyd Vest's house. And they died, and their grandson, Chris, inherited it, and he let it, didn't keep a roof on it, and it literally fell in. And I noticed the last year it has been torn down. But it was a fine house. So, aren't these some characters? The couple that's holding the child is Les Logan and Janie Ray, and the little boy is German Logan, and German used to live right in the crossroads of Forest Home and Old Hillsborough Road, and he and Vala were just wonderful people. But that's him. And then down below there is Lem's sister-in-law who married a Ferguson and their family. And the other guy over there was Albert and his wife Matilda. And I just found them because they were, the age looked right, and it said that he worked at the sawmill in 1910. So that was probably taken after 1910. Here's some more people, Joe Mays and his family, and Delray Reed. Now, Delray Reed was an orphan, and there was a little log house that hadn't been gone too many years between the Meacham house and the Parker house, and that's where somebody that lived there took in this boy, and they called him Delray Reed. He went to Bingham School for a little while. I don't know what became of him, but it just so happened there's a picture of him. The next at the bottom is Harley with his cousins. I don't know, I can't identify those. Here's another Madonna and child photograph. They're not, in the background is not the log smokehouse, but you'll notice there the swing set. This was kind of common. There's a lot of them in Liepers Fork. I don't know who was making them, maybe Lemuel Parker, but it's where the swing faces each other and the platform moves back and forth. The stone wall is still there. There's an iron fence. Yeah, you can still see the iron fence behind it there, and it was there. I went up there the other day to check it out. Here we have Millard and Harley. And then 2 years later, I'm going to say they're on the other side. You see how Harley's dressed up? It's a little, almost you can tell he's pampered. And then there he is with his mother and his uncle in the back there's John, and then of course this John Dorton, who is no kin, but they have taken him in. Unfortunately, I cannot identify that family. I've looked through the census, and it doesn't seem to add up with 3 girls, but there is John Tucker's daughter, which that would have been up Waddell Hollow, and then Dr. Edelman's daughter, which would have been in Liepers Fork. And this is a great photograph. This, of course, unfortunately, has got some damage on it, but that's Amanda Bingham Parker. Little Harley, that'd be her grandson. And then this Eleanor Jane Boyd McPherson is Laura's grandmother. And then, of course, there's Millard holding the dog. Apparently the Parkers were big dog fans. Can't figure out exactly what's going on there, but it may be a wedding or some kind of, but the girls there are holding a bouquet of looks like probably native flowers. And Hugh Smith is in there, that's written on there. And then Alina Grimes Smith, she's a sister-in-law, she's a sister to the Jenny over there. And then Mr. Green McPherson, he worked at John King place. He was one of the first recappers for tires. I've got a picture of him. I think I used it in the book on the square. But he was one of the first to vulcanize and retread tires. How many little towns and villages have a photograph like this? This is the old Liepers Fork Bank. It was started in 1911 and it's lasted until 1922. And a lot of old people used to tell me, oh, Daddy lost a lot of money in the bank. Well, if the truth be known, the bank only had like $10,000 operating expenses, and they weren't making enough money to even pay the clerk. So one Saturday, all the trustees of the bank met, and they said, you know, why don't we just give everybody their money back and close this building down? And that's exactly what they did. There wasn't just much money out there. There's a few people, the Meachams had some money, and the Hunters had some money, and they gave the money back and closed it down and sold the building. In the background, you'll see that 2-story house, and then there's another house in between there. Unfortunately, there was a fire in that 2-story building in 1931. Mrs. Zach Green was making preserves. Across the street, the Church of Christ was having their midsummer revival, and somebody just happened to look out and see that the roof was burning across the street, and so everybody went out of church, and they knew the Sweeney house was right next door, and it was going to catch on fire. There was no doubt about it. It was a hot day, dry day. So they went in and took the doors, the mantles, anything on it, all the furniture, took it and put it out in the street so it wouldn't burn. But the heat was so hot that the shake roof at the church kept catching on fire. We'll see a picture of it in a minute. And so the men had to climb up there and pour water on it to keep it from burning. This is a very nostalgic view of the village. You're looking east, I guess, standing not in front of the church, but close to it. And you see the bank. And there was a store there. Mr. Gus Carl ran the store. And it just looked like something out of a movie, the scene to me. And then, of course, this is John Parham and his wife, Virginia, and Laura, which married Alec Jones. And then there's Bunyan Parham. And he later, that was his house. He raised his family there. And he married one of the Blankenship girls, Bonnie Blankenship. And then you see the old store. Now, pretty much today, this hasn't changed a great deal if you go to Liepers Fork. And the post office was there from 1818 to 1918, except for there was occasion during, of course, that great unpleasantness in the mid-1860s, the post office was discontinued. But you can see the bar there that you would hitch your horses to. And I used that picture. Mr. Bunyan loaned me that picture to copy, and I didn't think to ask him who took it, but I'm pretty sure that's Lemuel Parker. And then, of course, you're looking in the same direction, but just further back, and you can see at that time people came to church in their buggies and horses, and they hitched them up and went to church, and it didn't interfere with the turnpike. Now you'll notice on the other side of the street, one of the great citizens of that little village, the burg as some of them call it, was Joseph L. Sweeney. He, on his own accord, built the sidewalk. Today they bricked it, but before he had yellow rock lining it, and then they went to the creek and got the sand and the gravel and filled it up. And so that little town had a sidewalk before some places in Franklin did. Looking further down into the village in the back there, you can see, of course, the bank. And across the street, the two-story building there you're going to see again, but that is Dr. Tucker's doctor's office. And then the big building behind it, of course, was built in 1914, and that was the Oddfellows Hall on the top floor, and Mr. Frank Gray had his drugstore and grocery store on the first floor. And when I was researching this, I one day was in the nursing home visiting Mr. Jerome Lunn, who's one of the brightest men and the kindest man. And I said one day, you know anything about the old store? He called it the Southall store because the Southalls owned it later. And he said, I guess I do. I dug the foundation. He said, I quit school in 1914 to go down there and build that foundation. And so you can't get a better story than that. And sure enough, I found in the paper where they were opening the Frank Gray drugstore and store, and it was 1914. And then I found I have in the book on Liepers Fork, there is a flyer that has the Oddfellows Lodge, and it lists all the members. And so he was right. Here again is the man, Joseph L. Sweeney. The Sweeneys were kindly a family. When I went to Hillsboro in 1971, one of the best things that ever happened to me, Miss Milbury Mahan took me down to introduce me to the Sweeneys. And they were a group of 3 sisters and a brother. And they adopted me. And I felt at home there anytime I wanted to go in and visit with them. But their grandfather was Joseph L. Sweeney, and so I've gotten personal stories from them about their grandfather. And he must have been a real whiz. In 1913, as you can see there, his wagon, if you can read that, it's patented in September 30th, 1913, and it was a U.S. patent, and they had the patent, and I think they gave it to me, and it's in one of my files. But anyways, he had one of his sons go around with the little model, and I had that at one time, but I gave it to the grandson because he deserved it. It was his family, not mine. But what was so great about it, you'll see in another picture, the sides, if you wanted to haul hay, you could let it out and it would have bulk. Or if you're hauling wood or corn, you could put it upright, the sides upright, and haul that. And he invented that. Now, his house unfortunately burned in 1931, and because all the doors, everything in the house just about was dismantled. They did it so quick because there were so many there. All the furniture was saved. Then when they built it back, they built it pretty much today. It's standing, and you look at it and you see, yes, that's almost the same house. I don't think it maybe has enough filigree and that you would expect. But the Church of Christ is right across the street, and this family was what you call dyed-in-the-wool Church of Christ. Beautiful voice. They sang a cappella on the porch, and you feel like you were in another time. Here's the working part of it. This set right in the village across from the bank and next to the Church of Christ. You can see in the lower picture there, the Church of Christ is in the background. And again, he's got the sides down on the bed so you can see how it was used for hauling hay. And then, of course, you see the men there. They also made wagons. He did blacksmithing, but he was an industrialist. He really had an eye for making things work. And this is, I think, a great picture of that town. And it was a great place. That's probably the nerve center of town. Everybody would stop by there and catch the gossip and the news of the day. J.T. Sweeney was a son, and he had his blacksmith shop. If you know where Puckett's is in Liepers Fork, they tore down the blacksmith shop in 1952 or 3 to build Puckett's. And then the house that you see that J.T. Sweeney was in, Mr. Leahy had bought that in the 30s, and he moved the house back as far as he could. The stage is there today, and he built a filling station for Mr. Pewitt, who was his son-in-law. But that's an interesting house, and unfortunately, the house was torn down probably about 1991. It had been rented and it was in disrepair. Here's another doctor. This is Dr. Drake, and he and his family are sitting out on the porch there. This is one I don't understand why he didn't. His other photographs were so well proportioned. To me, he should have backed up a little bit and got the house, but apparently he was more interested in Dr. Drake. And this is Dr. Tucker, N.M. Tucker, and he came to Liepers Fork in 1906. Now, the old Hillsborough High School Academy closed in 1905, and the county bought it and made it the Hillsborough School, 1 through 12. Dr. Tucker, there was a music room there, and he bought the music room and rolled it down to across the road from his house and made his doctor's office there. And you can see he and his daughter there are sitting on the porch. Now, probably in the 1940s, it stayed. Dr. Coles had an office there. I think the health department even used it for a little while as a clinic for kids getting vaccinations and stuff like that. Well, the John Burdett bought it, and he turned it and made it parallel to the road and made his house, put a porch on it facing the road. And then in 1993, no, maybe 94, Aubrey Preston bought it and stripped it down. And when they took off some of the paneling, the chalkboard was still there with the musical notes on it. That was a great find. Here's the two houses of worship that's in the old village, and of course you'll see the Liepers Fork Church of Christ, which was the first Church of Christ in Williamson County. It was organized in 1831, and it was for economical reasons, I guess. The Baptist, the Methodist, the Cumberland Presbyterian, and the Church of Christ took turns of using the building. One Sunday, one would have it, and another. In time, the different churches built their own individual churches, and so they ended up, the Church of Christ, the Christian church, was the one man standing. And so this building you see there was built in about 1876. They tore down the old church and built this one. And you see the steeple today is not as tall, and that's because in 1931, the fire across the road did get onto the tower, bell tower, and so they lowered the steeple to what it is today. The Hillsboro Methodist Church was built in 1911, and the little country churches, in Williamson County, and I guess throughout Middle Tennessee and around, are having trouble because new people moving in, and they don't want to go to a little church. They got children, they want a Sunday school program, they want a gym to play in, but the church at Liepers Fork, the Methodist Church, is really holding on, and it's a nice little church, building-wise, nice brick church. And the real economic engine for Liepers Fork, of course, started in 1909 when the Middle Tennessee Railroad came from Franklin through Liepers Fork, on down to Boston, on over down to Water Valley, and on into Mount Pleasant. And it made 2 trips a day. It started out being a big steam engine, and they found out, there just wasn't enough movement out there. So they went to a little dinghy, they called it, and it was operated by a gasoline engine. But it used the tracks. But for that area, most everything west of Hillsboro, particularly on the Backbone Ridge and on out towards Pinewood Road, had great timber. And a lot of it had never been cut because there wasn't any way of getting it to town to sell it. So the Southalls built their mill right there next to the depot, and of course the railroad was there, and they were cutting the best walnut and maple for flooring. One of the things on this lower picture you'll see on the other side of the railroad track, which is right next to the creek, a company came in here and started buying up all of the dogwood and hornbeam trees. If you know anything about the hardwood. So that's really why you don't see any big dogwood's a slow grower. It takes years for it to get any size. And they were making shuttles there, and so Mr. Sweeney told me as a boy he'd go and watch them make shuttles, and of course they'd load them up and ship them to wherever the textile companies were. They were all over Tennessee and North Carolina. But hornbeam and dogwood trees almost disappeared from the at least Backbone Ridge. This is a great scene. In Franklin, during the teens and the 20s, the businessmen in town wanted the country folks to come to town to trade. And so they had what was called Franklin's Boosters. And this is one of the first ones, and they came by train. And you can see the men up there are dressed in blackface, and you see it says, "We want your trade." And they really came to entertain the local folks and giving out little gifts to get them to come to town. And it worked. I've studied this picture many, many times, and the guy standing there with the cigar in his mouth up towards the front is Mr. Owen, Mr. Frank and Ida Mae and Sue's daddy. The rest of them I can't make out. But you see the depot is very similar to the one that's still standing at McKnight Station, which is further down into Murray County. But a great picture. Unfortunately, you see it's kind of crackled there. I made the mistake. I was showing it to the kids at school one day, and I was using an opaque projector. And I got busy talking, and I forgot to take it out from under the heat, and so it's not there. If Steve George is here, he may have the original to this, because this came from Mr. Gooch, Joe Gooch. Mr. Joe Gooch, unfortunately his house is not in here, but he lived right as you go into the village, and his only job was the railroad. He started in 1909 as a young man, and he worked the railroad, rode twice a day. And he said he was going down into getting down around McKnight Station. He said every other day or so there was a farmer standing there with a a milk can, and they'd load it on the train and send it to Franklin. And he said they kept doing that, and he said, you know, he doesn't have any cows. So one day he opened it up and it was moonshine. He was shipping his moonshine on the Doodlebug into Franklin. Those guys in Murray County are clever. This house, unfortunately, is no longer standing, but there's one on the same foundation that is there. This is called Benton Heights. It was built about 1910 by W.L. Pinkerton, who was the guy that convinced the locals to start the bank. He was from down in Centerville, and he came up here and said, there's enough capital in this little community and the people need a bank. And so he started the bank, and he built this house. Near this place is where the Benton sister, Thomas Hart Benton's family came here, and the girls died of TB, and they were buried up on this hill, and it was enclosed with a nice rock fence. When Mrs. Benton left to go to St. Louis, she paid to have this nice rock wall built, and one of the houses in town has a foundation out of those rock, and it's very possible it could be this one. Richard and Florence Pigg lived here later, and then Henry Davis was living there when it burned in 1936. This is a great picture. Miss Lizzie Walker had been a slave. I want to think the guy standing next to her is Mr. Hunter, who was in the Civil War as a servant to Dr. George Hunter. And then this is his son and daughter-in-law. And then on the other side, you'll see is Miss Emily Sparkman Prowl, and she's dressed there in her widow's weeds, and she's mourning her husband's death. He had died in 1903. And then there's Clint and his wife, and Clint Shaw taught school for a little while, and then when they started the rural route system, he got the mail route that was Liepers Fork and on up Bending Chestnut and Old Natchez Trace and all. And then he came to town and worked in town in the post office. Yes, this is a post-mortem photograph, and it's Herman Martin, and he was a young boy. Mr. Will Martin was his father, and he's buried up in the cemetery at Liepers Fork. Somebody was talking to me about kind of gross to find pictures of dead folks, and I remember in East Tennessee, some of my relatives had corpse pictures all over the wall. When they'd have a funeral, they'd take a picture of the mother or the grandmother in the casket. So I guess they carried on this tradition here in Middle Tennessee too. But this is Bob Martin's uncle. No, maybe great uncle. These guys, I think, had just joined the Army, and they had gotten their haircut, and then it's kind of a funny thing where they're sticking their head through this piece of cloth, it looks like, and I'm sure this is John Dorton down at the bottom. He's the one, I think, that was kind of adopted by the Parkers. These other guys I don't recognize, but it's heads up to them, but this is our end. Any questions? Anybody got any questions? Yes, sir, Mike.
Did the druggist Frank Gray then come to Main Street?
He did, and he started Gray Drug.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure did. He actually he was in partnership with Mr. Moran, John Moran, and then John Moran had made enough money. He retired and sold the business to Frank Gray. Yes.
When he took one of those pictures with those glass plates, was it like where you had to stand there for a minute or two?
I suspect it was slow motion, yeah, and it was probably I think it's probably a tripod. I mean, that was that period where you had a a cloth over your head and where you could focus. I think it was. Anybody else?
The pictures where there's like a backdrop or like kind of a formal,
Yes.
was that in his house or?
I think
did
it was at his house because he didn't have a studio. You know, everybody had curtains, and they, or a lot of these traveling photographers used quilts and coverlets in the background. Or, I think my grandmother, I've got a picture of her family, and they had cedar trees. They'd cut little cedars and made that the backdrop. Yes.
Rick, would it be appropriate on J.L. Sweeney to address his role in the formation of the quote subdivision in?
Yes. I should have said that because Silas is right about that. He had some land that went all the way back to the school. And Mr. Pinkerton, who was the banker, you know, bankers always like people to borrow money to build a house. And so he talked Mr. Sweeney into subdividing his little farm into lots. And it was good for Mr. Sweeney because he gave his children all a lot in the subdivision, and he named the street beside his house Joseph Street. And then there's Sycamore Street and Elm Street. And then if you turn to the right, you'll come right out at the old school. And the kids called that lane back there Dog Leg Alley because it went out and then it made a dog leg and turned. And that was kind of a saying. But he also brought, he had I'd love to talk to him. One day he realized there wasn't any water in the village. Everybody had a cistern or tried to dig a well. And he looked across the hill over there at it was Mr. Henry Davis's place then. Later B.F. Inman owned it. And he noticed there was a spring up there, and he said, you know, if we tapped that spring and dug a line over here, people in my subdivision can have water. And that's exactly, he got the boys to go over there and start digging so much, he'd pay them so much to dig so many feet, and they piped water in, and so Hillsborough had running water before a lot of people did. Later, what happened, that became obsolete because Franklin got their water for many years from Kingfield, Pinewood Road, Garrison. And so that water ran right through the village. And so the people in Hillsborough were able to tap on. And so all those people they called it the O-line, and they didn't pay water.
That was the Mayberry?
And Mr. Mayberry, Henry Mayberry here in Franklin had a spring up there between Hillsborough and Kingfield, right. And it was a big spring, and he's the one that said, you know, we can get water. It's higher, the elevation is higher. Gravity flow will bring it to Franklin, and then they pumped it into the water tower behind the courthouse, and that gave water pressure to the town of Franklin. Yeah, thank you for bringing that. I didn't include that in my talk. Anybody else? Well, guys, I appreciate you coming out today, tonight, I guess it is, and listening to me ramble.
Thank you, Rick.
And don't tarry, get on home.